hello, doubters and backsliders. Welcome to the podcast that proves the damned say the damnedest things. I am Troy Waller, one of the co-hosts of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, and right here in the virtual space next to me, and for those of you on YouTube, probably somewhere here or here, is Brian McDowell. How are you, Brian?
Hey, great intro. I really like that.
Yeah, thanks. I was practicing it in the shower this morning. I was soaping up, lathering up, right, and going, the damned say the damnedest things. Yeah, I got that off actually an atheist website once years ago. Yeah,
Oh, okay, so it's
I can't lay
plagiarism.
claim to it. Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Footnote. Now it's research.
Yeah. No, I'm completely okay with that. I love plagiarism. It's and really AI these days allows us to plagiarize everything.
Yeah, well, no, I work in the AI space, and I'm gonna push back against that. It's not plagiarism unless you're downloading everything and feeding it into your AI, and then that's questionable, I think. Oh, look, it's yeah. Look, that's another episode for another podcast. All right, moving on.
Yeah. No, and for our listeners who are familiar with Troy joining two cults, he just introduced the third one that he's part of. So
yeah, well, no, I've left the Microsoft cult, as you know. I have stepped away and realized that I was drinking that Kool-Aid as well. So possibly three cults, yeah, but no, not anymore.
Yeah, not possibly. It's legit. But anyway, let us introduce Lucas Wilson, who we are going to refer to as Luke throughout the episode. But as Lucas or Luke referred to before, as we're having a bit of a pre-chat, is he can't really compete with that Luke Wilson, the actor. But, that's yet to be proven. So we will explore that as we go through the episode. So Lucas is a Canadian scholar, writer, and editor.
Hold on. You said we're going to refer to him as Luke, and then twice you've called him Lucas.
Yeah,
Which one is it, Brian?
Hey, the formal bit, the scholarly part of Luke is Lucas. So
I reckon we just say it's both.
Okay,
right?
It's fine.
Yeah.
All right, it's both. Fucking hell. So Lucas is a Canadian scholar, writer, and editor known for his work on LGBTIQ plus issues, particularly focusing on the harms of conversion therapy. So Dr. Wilson, because there's PhD involved
Hold on, that's three now. I thought it was Luke.
We've all got
sorry,
identities.
Luke. I know you're probably thinking they're just butchering my intro, and I'm really sorry, but standards, right?
I don't know who I am anymore, but that's fine. We'll figure it out.
None of us know who we are.
Should I take my ADHD medication?
I think you should. And take it and shelve some. That would be good. Amazing. So Dr. Wilson is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and was formerly the Justice, Equity and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary. That's some street cred, Luke/Lucas/Dr. Wilson. His academic work often explores the intersections of religion, trauma, and queer identity. Luke's the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, and that's what we're really going to talk about a lot today. And that's a powerful anthology published early this year in 2025. The book compiles personal narratives from the LGBTIQ plus community, and particularly for those who have endured those forms of conversion therapy that we know all too well, unfortunately. And what this book really aims to do, and I'm sure that Luke's life work is to also expose the pseudoscientific and traumatic nature of those practices and to honour the resilience of survivors. Luke, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you, and I just want to be clear: is it Luke, Lucas, or?
Let's get to the bottom of this.
Yeah. But you're happy with all of them. I know that. We talked about this before you came on. Hey, we want to ask you, right, the question that we ask everybody when they come onto our show, and take as long as you need to answer this because people are really keen to hear it from all our guests. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
Unfortunately, regretfully, yes. I was. Well, you know what? I started off as a fellowship evangelical Baptist, which is a sub-denomination of obviously the Baptists in Ontario. I'm from Toronto, born and raised, And I was in between middle school and high school. My brother got really into the creation versus evolution debate, and Ken Ham and these folks. And so he got me to start watching these DVDs back when DVDs were a thing. And it was these DVDs by Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind, also known as Dr. Dino, who technically has a doctorate, but it's from a degree mill somewhere in the flyover states in the U.S. But this guy who has no background in biology or geology or literally any science, he was the one who was doing these debates, and he was doing these debates with all these different, scientists and professors and whatnot. And so I started watching these DVDs with my brother, and he got me really sort of hooked on this. And I started, doing those deep dives into like, like those uncredible and in some ways incredible websites, creationist websites. And so I started getting really deep into this. And along the journey, my brother didn't necessarily really care to think, what was the logical next step. If in fact we believe that there's an intelligent designer, if there's a creator, what's next. For me, I thought, well, if I'm to believe this, I should probably go and connect with whatever God this is. And when I was young, and up until about maybe grade 2 or 3, my family, we went to this church, this Baptist church that was not too far from us. And I'm the youngest of 5. And in fact, I have my family, you can see at the back of my phone. This is actually our church photo from 1993. That's me with a mullet. And I've since grown this back a wee bit. I'm trying to fit in with the Australians. And so I got, involved in this youth group that was around the corner. Again, years after we had gone on and off when we were young. And when I was young, again, it wasn't like we were a Christian family by any means. It was really that, we went to church every so often, if at all. Because like any good Canadian family, we were typically at the cottage instead rather than going to church. And so if we were in the city and going to church, it was, again, pretty sporadic. And even when we did go, it was kind of like you went to church and then you got in the van and you shut the hell up about Jesus and you came home and that was it. So we didn't really have, a religious sort of, I didn't have, I should say more accurately. My siblings had a little bit more exposure to church than I did, but I really didn't have much. So by the time I got to high school,
you weren't really saved, is what you're saying.
I wasn't, but you know what, Troy? I was under the impression when I went back to that church again, at grade 9, that I was under the impression. But I remember there was a certain point in my grade 9 year that I was like, I don't think I was saved, and there was that whole sort of like realization and not crisis of faith, because at this point I believed, I was a real believer, but I realized that my childhood faith wasn't sufficient and that I needed to really rededicate myself, or perhaps dedicate myself to Jesus. And so so it was grade 9. I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. The writing was on the wall that I was a big old homo, but I didn't, I wasn't acknowledging this, and a lot of other people weren't either. It was sort of that open secret. And I went into art class on one day on like a Monday, and I went in and I said to my friend Becky, and Becky was this hilarious, like sort of like punk goth kind of gal, big blonde spikes, shaved side of her head, her tits were always out, and always wore black and, big boots. And so I went to Becky. I said, yo, Becky, do you want to go to church with me on Wednesday for youth group? And she was like, fuck yeah, I do. And so Becky and I went to church. Needless to say, Becky didn't, return. It was just me. And that was how I became involved with the youth group. And then how I became involved in the church. And it sort of snowballed into, my life as a teenage fundamentalist, though I didn't necessarily know what that term meant for quite a number of years in a more sort of academic sense. But I certainly was, drinking the Kool-Aid and a part of the team.
Yeah, nobody knows what that means when they're in the middle of it, right? It's something that we all wake up one day and go, "Oh, yeah." And look, I'm loving your accent, by the way. You and some of the lingo that you've dropped. I lived in Korea for a while, and I had Canadian roommates. So the way you say Toronto and a boot, and even heading out to the cottage, you've definitely established your Canadian cred there as well.
Thank you. It's funny when an Australian says that they like our accent. We're absolutely enamored with yours, so I'll take it.
And I love the fact that also you're growing your mullet out to become more Australian. Mullets definitely have made a comeback. They've started to peel back a bit now, but there were, particularly through COVID, I know my kids were giving themselves the most horrendous bowl cuts hybrid with a mullet, and it was absolutely fucking horrendous. And thankfully they are fading. Your mullet is great. It's stylish.
Yeah, I was waiting for that. Oh, but not yours. But not yours.
No, I'm
You
not.
know what?
I'm not backpedaling. Yours looks fine. That's okay. You do not have a bowl cut and cut straight across and look like Lloyd Christmas from fucking Dumb and Dumber. But for now, can you, before we do get to your even more fundamentalist credibility that we're talking about before we press record, tell us about your family life growing up. Like, what were your impressions of the world? How did you experience the world and interpret the world within the context of the family you were within?
My dad was, this like super cool, like hippity dippity, like pot smoking, record store owning musician. And, he wrote a book on Bob Dylan and, was also eventually became a social worker with differently abled folks. Like he was a cool dude. He passed away when I was in high school, but for the 16 years I had him, the man was just like, he was very, very cool. My friends would come over to my house, not to hang out with me, but to hang out with him and, go in the music studio that we had in our basement. So, my dad was amazing. I was also, though, a mama's boy. And, growing up, my mom, although she turned out to be an absolute kook, growing up, she was fine. She was good. She was, she was good in a lot of ways. I shouldn't, poo-poo her, but I'm the youngest of five, like I said. My brother Josh, my brother Zach, my brother Quinn, and then the two sisters, Kaylee and Luke. So we sort of were the anchors of the family. But yeah, I was very close to my sister. Again, the writing was on the wall. I was close-ish to my brothers, depending on the time. But by the time I became religious, really, that was when I think my siblings were like, "What the hell is wrong with this kid?" And we're just sort of confused by it, because even though my oldest brother Josh had gone to youth group a little bit, by and large, it was very weird that I was doing what I was doing and how sort of obsessed I was with the church and with Jesus. And so I think, but putting all that aside, like at this point, my family and I are like, we're super, super close now. My siblings and I, my sister, my mom and I, we haven't talked in a while. But I think my mom was, maybe the best way to describe it was like haunted by her Baptist demons, growing, when I was growing up. And so that definitely came out in weird ways. My dad, agnostic at best, really, thought church was more of an intellectual exercise than anything. My dad was like a super, smart guy. So when he did go to church, he was sort of, thinking more, not in sort of spiritual terms, but I guess in intellectual terms. And so when I became a Christian, I know that my dad thought that was, wonky. And I know my mom loved it. She thought that was just great that, her son was going to church and that he was involved in the youth group. And, eventually I went to school at the world's largest evangelical university. And she thought that was just wonderful. And when I told her that I'd gotten a scholarship to go there, we were actually driving and she had to pull over to the side of the road because she was crying so much because I told her essentially like, I won't have to pay a lot of money. And she thought that was just wonderful. So all that to say, I come from a really beautiful family that I'm very, very thankful for in so many ways.
So what was it, do you think, that made the youth group attractive to you? That, what was it? Because one of the things that we talk about, and especially it's come up as a theme this series, is just about our vulnerabilities at the time and what drew us to church. And I'm not saying that the church was always preying on that. Certainly some do. But others are just trying to, do right by kids and have youth groups and do fun stuff. But what was it, do you think, that was appealing? And do you think there was something in you that you were trying to meet?
I think there are a few reasons that I became like why I dove head first into the church. In part, I think there was definitely this sort of, the catalyst was this creation versus evolution debate. I thought, okay, if I believe that there's a God, logically, I should go figure out who that God is. And at the time, what was logical to me was that it was going to be the God of the church that I went to when I was little. There wasn't a lot of sort of exploration spiritually other than within this specific religious tradition, i.e. the Baptist church that I went to. So that was certainly a big part of it. I think in other ways, my mom's influence definitely pushed me in that direction. I knew that this was like the right thing to do, according to her. I knew that she would like this, and therefore I thought, okay, so, and maybe I shouldn't say I thought, maybe it was more on the subconscious or unconscious level. But nonetheless, I think that certainly motivated me. And I thought that this was, again, the path I should take. I think also when I got to the youth group, like, because I wasn't raised in the church, I wasn't a weirdo. And I think that, like, when I showed up and they were like, oh my gosh, like a normal, or at least half normal, I'll take half normal, person or kid, shows up, they're, you feel like a cool kid in the youth group, right? Like, so many of them were like just bizarre. And looking back, like a real ragtag bunch. And then I showed up, and I think, again, it was like, I can hold a conversation. I can like make eye contact. And I think that this was sort of like novel for the homeschooled, and also just like the weird, sheltered kids.
Yeah, totally. It's like fresh blood. Tell us what it's like out there, right? Do kids really ride skateboards? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that for them, they thought that, again, I was half normal. And so, I think that certainly played a role. And, when I first got there, the youth pastor of the church, he was super invested right away. Like, he was like, hey, can I come to your high school and bring you pizza and we'll eat on the lawn together? And I was like, sure. And then we did. And I loved it because when we got to my high school, he tripped and fell with the pizza in front of like a bunch of people. And I was just like, oh my God, like what? Anyway, bizarre. But I think that he saw that I was, again, like half normal, and that was attractive in a social sense, right? And so,
and it's not abnormal to say to a kid, "Can I come to your school and bring pizza?"
Could you imagine?
What world do they come from?
Could you imagine looking back, like he was in his like whatever 20s, early to mid 20s, and I was like 14. I've actually never told the story about him falling and tripping, but I think it's just hilarious. I've thought about it.
That is great.
It's just so good, right? So anyway, so I think that he definitely invested into me right away, in the sense that he was like, let me like be your friend, and I'm going to be your youth pastor. And really quickly, because I was sort of this fast zealot, in the church, I think that he was like, let's bring this kid in and let's put him on like a leadership position. So I became like a student leader again. Before, I think even I really knew that I was really saved. It was just sort of like, I think I talked a big game, and that he was like, oh, you should be on the whatever high school leadership team, which I still didn't even know what the role really was, but it was nonetheless, official. So that was that. And it was, that's how I got involved. And I think on top of all of this, and I think that we're going to talk more about this, was the sexuality issue. That in my mind, if I'm a Christian, or if I'm following Jesus, I can't be gay. And so I think the church really offered me a really easy, convenient shield or mask or whatever, like persona, that allowed me, at least in my own estimation. I don't think that, again, I was all that, I was fooling many people. I watched like a lot of HGTV, like Home and Garden Television, right? Like, I don't think anyone was tricked, but I definitely thought, this is a way of like not only covering my sexuality, because I was certainly ashamed of it, but on top of that, I think it was also a way in my mind, that I could escape this. Like, I could find a way out of this through the redemptive and salvific power of Jesus, right? And I think these were certainly, if not conscious thoughts, again, just like my thought about how it was like pleasing to my mom, they were certainly like unconscious sort of motivations that underlaid why I was, involved in the first place.
Look, I'm a bit lost in my thoughts at the moment, because I'm a man edging into my mid-50s, and I find myself watching a fair bit of HGTV, and I'm just wondering, what does that say about me? Am I exposed here? I love that shit. So anyway,
Brian,
but that's
pardon me. I think we both know the answer here, Brian, and I'll let you be the judge. But
it's great. I'm loving it. I'm loving the way it's very Australian that you take the piss out of yourself too. So I think that is, and it's great, because some Americans won't understand, and many Canadians, I'm sure, what taking the piss does mean. Do you know what taking the piss means?
yeah, it's well, I thought it was a British term, and here I am saying yeah, and watch, I'm going to be dead wrong in like T-minus 2 seconds. But is it not like just like taking a joke?
Yeah, it's making a joke out of yourself. And look, it would be British, because pretty much we are just exported convicts from Britain anyway. So
it's taking the joke at someone else's expense, but in a not a really harmful kind of aggressive way. So you can take the piss out of yourself, you can take the piss out of someone else. It's what we do. And we've had Americans on who have said, oh, I must be taking a piss, and it's like, no, You're not taking a piss, you're taking the piss, which completely changes the context. Hey, but let's keep moving because we've started getting into the idea of sexuality, and that's why we're here, and we do want to talk about that. But before we do, let's just quickly talk about your absolute ultimate fundy cred, which is the university that you ended up going to. And you've told us you got a scholarship. I mean, Jesus, that's just full on. You were chosen, you were selected, you were part of the elect.
Yeah, I'm not trying to brag here, Troy, but I did receive a scholarship to go to Liberty University. Again, the world's largest evangelical university, originally a fundamentalist university, turned evangelical once they joined the Southern Baptist Convention. But yeah, I always say now and this is of course Jerry Falwell's university, later Jerry Falwell Jr.'s university, the one who was caught in a three-way cuckolding relationship with his wife, himself, and a Miami pool boy. A different story. We're not here for that. But I always say when I talk about getting a scholarship to go to Liberty University, in the same way that I say when I graduated summa cum laude from Liberty University, I always say, yeah, but I went to Liberty University. Right? Like it means literally nothing because I went to this, ultra conservative Christian school. When I was there, I was like heavily involved. I was a prayer leader for like a year. Also, I was like a campus tour guide. I was involved in all these different sort of like organizations on campus, mostly academic. I won like the community service award, which like anyway. And so yeah, I think that I was in it to win it. I was given it that good old college try to be the person I thought I had to be, but it's such a hard pill to swallow that they received the same accreditation as, say, for instance, Duke or University of Virginia or Emory, like all these other schools that are within the same accrediting region of the U.S. So yeah, I regretfully went to Liberty University.
And what were you studying there?
So I did my undergrad in English with a minor in French and a minor in history. I think it's more accurate to say that I learned or have received an education in conservative U.S. politics and culture and evangelical sort of, the evangelical world down there, because, Liberty is an incredibly political institution as well, like many fundamentalist and, evangelical churches or organizations today. Liberty would invite all these different political speakers. And so, most recently, Trump has spoken there multiple times. He's gotten 2 honorary doctorates. Mike Pence has an honorary doctorate. Franklin Graham has an honorary doctorate, if I'm not mistaken. At least he spoke at their commencement. So if he had done that, yes, he would have gotten an honorary doctorate. So it's this incredibly political school with a lot of ties to a lot of really scary and powerful evangelical and fundamentalist organizations throughout the US and ultimately throughout the world.
You're pretty involved and you're pretty hardcore in terms of your credibility. But what's happening for you at the time? You're obviously you're gay, and you just what is happening? You're in that environment which is not going to be queer affirming in any sort of way. So what's happening inside your head? Like what is going on? Are you in denial, or are you thinking that you're going to pray the gay away? What's going to happen?
Yeah, so a big motivating factor for why I even went to Liberty was the fact that I knew that they had, and I wouldn't have used these terms at the time, but I knew that they had a conversion therapy program. And the way that they framed it was that it was like they had pastoral counseling. It's always pastoral counseling or biblical worldview counseling, whatever whatever dog whistle they use. It's a euphemism for conversion therapy, but they had advertised when I had gone down and visited the school. I actually went down and visited the school 6 times on like a bus before I eventually went. But I went down and I saw after chapel, they had, they call their chapel convocation. But after convocation and before convocation, they would have on these screens in the same way that, a mega church puts up, or any church really, I guess at this point, puts on a projector on those screens, like the lyrics for worship services. Afterwards, they would rotate through different on-campus, and I guess, no, it was all on-campus announcements. And one of the announcements, mixed in amongst other things, like there's a concert, there's a basketball game, whatever. One of the announcements was, it asked a question, and it was something along the lines of, do you struggle with same-sex attraction? Which of course the book that we're going to talk about later is a play on this phrase. But I'm standing there and I'm like, I struggle with same-sex attraction. I'm like, guilty as charged, cuff me. And so I sort of clocked it. I noticed it. And I was like, okay, let me write this down or whatever. And so I said, afterwards to a friend who was a student there at the time. I said, hey, what's this? The guy's name was Dane Emmerich, who ran the conversion therapy program, the pastoral counseling program. I said, to my friend, I said, like, what's this business of this Dane Emmerich guy? Like, what's he doing with like same-sex attracted guys? And they were like, oh yeah, there's this guy and he works with two groups of students. One group was those who were addicted to porn. And of course, like all research suggests that you cannot be addicted to porn. That's a complete and total fabrication. That's like mythical. And the other group was those who were addicted to homosexuality. And here I was. So I knew this going into Liberty, that there was this guy who promised to be able to help young queers. And because in high school, I couldn't do anything with not, like I couldn't go on dates with, guys, because they would say to me, well, wait a second, aren't you a Christian? Don't you love Jesus? And if I, went on a date with a guy, that'd be bad PR for Jesus. It'd be a bad witness. So I was like, I can't do that in high school. But my big idea was, once I got to Liberty, since everyone's an evangelical and since everyone, is a Christian, well, no one's going to, like, if I do something with a guy, well, he's not going to tell on me. And B, he's not going to think, oh, aren't you a Christian? Because he's a Christian too. So let me go have my like gay Christian fun for however long. And then at the end, I was like, and then I'll go meet that pastor, go through that program, and then, find a wife. Any wife will do. And then, back to Canada, I'll go and live that, godly heteronormative life.
Luke, I just want to say this sounds a lot like my plan to leave the Revival Center, which was this cult that I was in as a teenager. So the idea, like you had it all like sorted out and this is how it's going to work. And I'm just guessing that it didn't play out the way that you planned. Because they have every door bolted. They have every window locked, right?
Yeah, it's hermetically sealed. And so about 2 weeks into my undergrad, first year, freshman year, as they call it in the States, I get there and there was this, on every dormitory hall that, we lived on, or I lived on, and all the different dorms across the campus, there were two RAs who were the heads of the hall. They were in charge of everything. Under them were two spiritual life directors, under them prayer leaders, and then the rest of us plebeians who weren't, spiritual enough to be on leadership. Though again, eventually I was, just to again to reiterate, to make a fine point.
Not to brag.
Yeah, no bragging
but eventually
here,
you were.
Yeah, not in this house, but absolutely I was a prayer leader eventually. So I get on this hall, and it's like 2 weeks into school, one of my spiritual life directors, he like makes this like flirty move. I remember I was making my bed, and it was a loft bed. So I was standing on like a 6 foot high dresser or 5 foot high dresser, whatever it was. And I'm standing there, and I got, just before school, I went, back to school shopping. And I got what I thought were boxer briefs, but I found out they were just briefs, and I didn't know the difference at the time. And I'm too Scottish, aka cheap, to like throw things out. So I was like, I need to wear these. And when I opened up the package, there's all these tighty whities. And so I'm standing there on the top of this dresser, making my loft bed, and I'm in my little tighty whities, nothing else. And all of a sudden, my spiritual life director comes up from behind me, and approaches my door and is like, "Hey, Luke," and I'm like, "What the hell?" And so I'm like, "Oh, hey." It was like. He's like, makes some sort of like whatever, like flirty advance, and he's like, what are you doing Friday? I said, probably hanging out with you. Like my first time flirting, right? Such a smooth operator. And so then he's like, cool. And he like kind of like saunters away, and that was it. Well, Friday comes around. He's like, what do you want to do? I was like, I don't know. What do you want to do? He's like, want to watch a movie? I was like, sure. So we watched like The Dark Knight Rise or whatever, Dark Knight Rising, the Batman movie. Like, what are two young gays watching a Batman movie?
I'm assuming it's not, spoiler alert again, it won't just be The Dark Knight Rising here.
Well, there are other things rising, Brian, and you should know that of all people.
Oh, well,
as a fellow member of the community. So
I was really hoping. Sorry, just before you go on with this story, I was really hoping he was going to say, "Hey, can I come to your school and bring pizza?" That's what I was hoping for, but no.
Yeah, and then he'd have a wipeout. Just like anyway. So anyway, I fell asleep, and I never fall asleep during movies typically. Although in my old age now, I'm falling asleep. But at the time, wide-eyed and whatever, and I fell asleep. Well, I wake up, and he says, "Wait, hey, the movie's over. Do you want?" As if this is like a normal question. He says, "Do you want to sleep in here tonight, or do you want to sleep in your room?" And I was like, "Well, I'm down to sleep in here, but let me go get my comforter and like my blanket. Like, why would I get anyway? So I go and get my goosebumps.
Not meaning the Holy Spirit.
No, no, there was not a
Let
foot
me get
between
my
us.
comforter. Way to ruin it, Luke.
Yeah, my my holy comforter. Well, anyway, there's a pun in there. But so I go and get my Goosebumps comforter, which like R.L. Stein, those like horror books for kids. I would get this colorful comforter, bring it back in, and into the bed we go. Well, long story short, things happened, and the next morning when things sort of finished, he was like immediately got out of bed, and he's like, I could tell he's sort of like awkward and weird and nervous. And anyway, again, needless to say, like a whole wave of evangelical shame just like washed over him. And I said, and I love it too, like looking back, I said something along the lines of, I was like, so you going to the football game later today? Like, again, a place that I should never have been, but at a football game, like, could you imagine? So he's like, no. And he was giving me these one-word answers, not really talking to me. And then eventually I was like, I think this is my cue to leave. So I left. Well, later that night I messaged him. I said, hey, I think we should probably talk about what happened. And he said, well, there's nothing to talk about. And I'm like, well, according to my side of the story, there's a lot to talk about. Because again, it's like my first sort of like encounter with a man, and he refused to talk to me. So what I did, like every good young angsty queer, was I wrote a poem about it, and then I would go and cry in the parking lot pretty much every night, if not every day. And so, I felt terrible about it, and I was like, clearly, like my friends were starting to notice that something was wrong, but I refused to tell anyone what was happening. And the most I said to one friend was, his name was Michael. The most I said to Michael was this wonderful redhead from Indiana. And he said, he's like, Luke, what's going on? I said, well, I can't really tell you. I said, there's a problem with my SLD, my spiritual life director. But I can't really go into much detail past that. And he said, well, why? And I said, well, it doesn't matter, but you know what? Actually, I did write a poem about it. Do you want me to read it to you? Like the art school boy, like high school kid, came out, and I was like, I need to like perform this. And so I performed my sadness by way of poetry. And so I read him this poem. It was called, You Ever Notice How Cold It Gets in the Fall? So I read him this god awful poem. And afterwards, Michael, whenever we talked about anything sexual, Michael, he would get and it was the same as my grandma. She always had these quivery lips. Well, whenever Michael and I would talk about anything sexual, he'd get like Nana's lips. He'd get these like quivery, like sort of lips. And he said, I think I know what your poem's about. And I was like, oh, shit, like my cover's blown, like I'm in trouble. And I said, well, what do you think it is? And he said, well, I don't want to guess and be wrong. And I was like, wait a second, why would that be a problem? And he said, well, because I struggle with the same thing. And the moment he said struggle, I was like, oh, I know this bitch. I was like, oh, tell me what you mean. And then it was sort of this like fumbling back and forth. And by the end of it, we were both like, I struggle with same-sex attraction. Oh, I struggle with same-sex attraction. And then it was like my first like coming out, other than one time on MySpace, but that was like when I was like 14 and anyway, sad. But I was sad again. And here's another moment anyway that I come out. So I come out to Michael, but the thing was, is I didn't really want to be like an emotional burden to Michael. And so I thought, well, maybe I should just sort of fast track that idea of, going to that pastor on campus. And that's, eventually what led me to him.
So you didn't get outed, though. It's not like one of these people told. I was waiting for someone to tell on you. As we say in Australia, dob you in, tell on you, make a big scene. But so that didn't really happen.
No, what did happen was one night, because I was so pissed off that he wouldn't talk to me, Matt. I was like, I'm going to march into his room and confront him. Because, we lived on the same hall. We saw each other all the time. We were at like different dorm events together. We sat in chapel 3 times a week together. So I always saw him, but I was like, I'm going to confront him. So I gathered the courage, and I marched down to his room, and I walked inside of his room. I didn't even knock. I went in and I said, hey, we need to talk. And then he was sitting on his couch, and he was like looking like this, and he looks at me. And then he just like looked up into the corner of the room, and I look up into the corner of the room, and there's his roommate. I was like, oh shit. And so I was like, we'll talk later. And I ran right back out. So that was like pretty close to me outing myself. But no, I didn't get caught. We didn't get caught somehow. Like his roommate was in the room when everything happened, which I still don't understand how he didn't know. But I guess evangelicals are not known to be the smartest of folks. And so, long story short, I eventually, the way that I suppose I was outed, but it wasn't really outing. It was me telling someone, was that I was like, I need to go talk to that pastor. And so the pastor I was like, I didn't want to get in trouble just in case he was like gonna, get me in trouble for admitting that I had done what I had done. So I made up a fake email. And speaking of football from before, I was like, what's the furthest thing from Luke, like 18-year-old Luke, possible? So my email was something like Texas football fan, like 1995 or whatever it was. Meanwhile, it was like a gay kid from Toronto. So I sent him, Pastor Dane, my conversion therapist, I sent him this email saying, hey, if I come talk to you, will I get in trouble? He said, no, if you're not self-harming in a physical sense, we're not gonna, your secret's safe with me. And that's how I eventually went and met with him.
So you've met with him, but we're assuming, and we really want to get to the book, but obviously to contextualize some of that, because a lot of the book is telling the stories of conversion therapy. You underwent conversion therapy yourself. Tell us a bit about that, and for those that don't necessarily know what conversion therapy is, a bit of a high level points. What is it, and what was your experience of it?
Yeah, so conversion therapy at its core is the attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression. Oftentimes, those things are understood in tandem because for conversion therapists, they believe that at the end of the day, it's not a sexuality issue at its core for those of us who are queer, or for them, homosexuals. It's instead, it's a gender issue, and that according to these folks, again, this is typically how it's understood, and it's understood in tandem with other ways of conceptualizing homosexuality as an addiction, as a social pathology, among other things. But really, it's believed to be that it's an underdeveloped gender identity. So for those of us who are queer, for us, let's use me as an example. For me, as a young gay kid, I didn't align with what it meant to be masculine according to their understanding of masculinity. And because I didn't, align to this understanding of masculinity, I was living more so, again, according to these folks, within the feminine world. And I was more feminine, which is like absolutely true. Like I was in my sister's closet playing with her dresses, like eating her makeup, like nail polish, all of the above. And that's all accurate. And for them, again, they're saying, okay, so if that's the case, if you were living more in the world of femininity with girls and you were hanging out with girls more so, which was kind of true. Like I had a bunch of girlfriends, but also a bunch of like, guy friends. They said, once you hit puberty, you go for what's opposite of you. And so within this binary understanding of the world, of course, evangelicals operate within the binary, like it's their job. And in some ways it is, they said that you go for what's opposite. So for me, if I'm living in the world of femininity, what was opposite for me was masculinity. So I became attached to or attracted to the opposite, masculinity, and therefore I was attracted to, at the time, boys and then eventually men. So the way to correct this, according to conversion therapists, is that if you are to address and or change someone's gender identity, and also their expression, and oftentimes the way that you change one's gender identity is by changing how they express that identity. So for me, I was told, you need to go and do carpentry or like play sports. And I was like, carpentry, like how Jesus of you, right? Like you're asking me to do woodwork. Like I don't think you're asking, but neither here nor there. And they would try to get you to sort of operate in more masculine terms. And then when you operate in more masculine terms, you're not just acting like a man, you eventually become a man. And of course, part of that, what it means to be a man, is this essentialist understanding of gender, where a man or a real man is straight. So that's the ideology and the conversion ideology that undergirds conversion practices. However, for me, I shouldn't say however, that tracks with my experience. So for me, I went to that pastor, and I met with him, quite frequently. And I went into the one-on-one conversion therapy program at Liberty, but I also went into the group therapy. The group therapy program, I talk about that in the book. That's the story that I pass along there. But putting that aside, and because I only went once to that, but I wanted to give some representation of that experience. That's why I wrote about it in that book. My experience in one-on-one conversion therapy will be perhaps for the next book. But when I was went to this pastor, his name was Pastor Dane Emmerich. He was not a licensed therapist, and not that I should say that there are actually a number of conversion therapists who are licensed, which is even more horrifying, but he wasn't. He was a pastor with very few credentials, and he was, again, on staff at Liberty, and in large part, the groups that he worked with were those who, again, were addicted to porn, quote unquote, addicted to homosexuality. So we worked together over the span of my 4 years at Liberty. And initially the experiences, or the sessions, were very much like sort of like trying to establish a foundation for us to lay the groundwork for later when we would meet again quite regularly. So the first few sessions were like very pseudo-Freudian, right? Like there were these weird attempts to understand human sexuality by way of, well, really his understanding of sexuality, or conversion therapists, conversion ideology more broadly. But it was like kind of taking a little bit from Freud and taking a little bit from like pop psychology, and like a buffet, sort of like leaving everything that you don't want, everything that's like inconvenient for your theory. And again, evangelicals are not the most consistent folks. And so what really the argument was that for me, my relationship with my dad was phenomenal, but my relationship with my mom was great. However, according to him, and it is true, like my mom was overbearing, that because I had an overbearing mom who was like emotionally dependent on me from once my dad died, and even before, that must have been the source of my same-sex attraction. And so that's really what laid the groundwork. But after that, like the sessions that we had, a lot of them they were all talk therapy. And so a lot of them involved, or all of them involved, us reading scripture together, us reading my conversion therapy manual. Mine was called Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey by Alan Medinger. I got off the path and I need to just get back on. And so that was the manual. And then he always prayed for me. I never prayed for myself, which I think is quite telling, that he was the one to intercede on my behalf, as opposed to me directly accessing God, which of course within Protestant traditions, that's kind of like our big thing. But within those sessions, he was the one who always prayed for me. There was also a tactile aspect, and I don't mean to say that he like molested me or anything. What I will say was that it was very bizarre, and looking back, it's just like wildly weird to think about. Whenever we would start our sessions, and also whenever we would end our sessions, he would always give me this big bear hug. And the way that I conceptualized it back then was that he was sort of showing me like good touch, bad touch, in like the most like infantilizing way possible. And this is how men can like interact physically and that kind of thing. And so he'd always give me these big hugs. But then whenever we were praying, he would always lay his hands either on my shoulder, but more often on my leg. And on my leg, it was not like, I talked to a friend about this who also met with him. My friend said it wasn't like so far up your leg that it was like stop, but it was like far enough you're like, like it was that sort of like blurry line. And of course, like I know now why he was doing it. But it was just this like bizarre, again, sort of effort to model masculinity and tactile sort of like interactions. But that was a big part of it. And when I tell people about this, they oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, sometimes, and this is mostly sort of like people on like faceless profiles on like social media who are like, that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds kind of fine. And it's like, sure, like what a privileged thing to say, but okay. But when I think about now, like the violence of conversion therapy and the difficult sort of like impact, at the time when I was meeting with him, like we met again quite regularly, but when we met, he oftentimes, and he actually he was very explicit about this, that he wanted to separate guilt from shame, which I think in some ways, at least in the moment, I think he achieved his goal in a way. And I want to qualify that of course, guilt being, okay, I've done this one bad thing, slap on the wrist, you get maybe like a timeout, get punished for it, and then you move on. Sort of like guilt is in response to one discrete or a few discrete actions. Whereas shame is not that, it's not that I've done something wrong, like one time or here, it's that I am wrong, like I'm the problem, right? So it's where like that negative emotion turns inwards as opposed to just, oh, that was that external moment or that discrete time. So for him, he would oftentimes, because again, I think part of his project with us queers was that he was trying to say like, hey, yes, the church has made you into like little, demons, and, that you might feel horrible, or you do feel horrible about yourselves, which we did. He was like, my goal is to get you not to feel like that, because he's like, he would always say like, you're not gay. And I'm like, well, the proof's in the pudding, my friend. But nonetheless, he said, you're not gay. You're a son of God, and your identity is not in your sexuality. You were a straight man just struggling with same-sex attraction. And that's how we were sort of like, it was a way of saying you're not like, if the homosexuality is the source of shame, well, you're not gay. Oh, okay. Well, that's easy, and then off, we go, and then we talk our way through, becoming straight. But the thing is that I think he really was trying to get rid of that shame and say like, hey, just because the church has made you feel this way, it's not right. And again, like, not to give him credit, because the man deserves literally no credit. But I think that was certainly part of his sort of like project. But on top of that, though, I think the issue is that although he might have tried to do that in the moment, right, where you go to him and almost like a Catholic priest, like you sort of confess your sins or whatever. Anyway, so you confess your sins onto one another, right? That kind of bullshit. And you sort of feel or alleviate that guilt for that discrete action or those actions that you did. Because for me, when I was meeting with him on that weekly basis, he would ask me for a weekly inventory of my victories, so moments I escaped temptation, and then my slip ups, which were the times that I gave into temptation. So we would talk about those times I slipped up or gave into temptation, and then we would say, okay, wrong, but let's move forward. Let's not do that again. So that was his, again, in those moments. The problem was once I left Liberty, once I left Pastor Dane, and I was back in Ontario where I'm from, and I was in grad school. I didn't have this weekly reminder that everything's going to be okay. You're straight. You're just struggling with this and you're going to find victory in Christ, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden I was by myself and I started to realize, oh shit, this isn't changing. Like nothing here is going away. If anything, my desires are getting stronger because I don't have as much of a distraction like I did before, living on Liberty University's campus. And if I believe that God's a good God and that God is the giver of good gifts and will only, wants me to give up this, this struggle, as they put it, and God's perfect, that means that if I'm not changing, well, it's not God's problem. God's not the issue. What's the issue? Me, right? And that's when that sort of, that guilt really turned into shame, and that shame turned into self-hatred. That self-hatred just turned into self-abnegation, where it was this whole spiral, right? Where I was like, oh man, I'm the problem. And when you see yourself as a problem, of course, that's a problem. And so that's really, I think, for me, the violence of conversion therapy was ironically my time after conversion therapy, not as much in the moment, although there were, of course, certain things that were weird and, messed up and weren't good. But I would say that's the violence, is really the aftermath.
Yeah. Luke, coming back to, and that's full on, right? I think for some of us, like I was in a church where we had an Exodus ministry. So there was, conversion therapy. They may not have called it that, but that sort of stuff was going on, trying to straighten people out or at least help them to live with what they were going through. One of the things that I always wondered is what the hell goes on in there, right? What are they actually doing in these sessions? And there was a couple of things that I was listening to that I could hear was definitely happening in there as well. And one of the things was trying to make them more masculine and, connect with other men. And so what would happen is you get guys from the Exodus program that all of a sudden want to hang out with you and do stuff, and sort of do guy things. And that was one of the things that they were encouraged to do, like not with necessarily other people in the program, but go and hang out with, real men being men. That was one of the things that they did. The other thing that I know actually, and this is from a friend that I was talking to, was they would take stock of your, in air quotes, thought life. And so they were really quite intrusive in terms of what are you thinking about? And I'm just wondering, that verse, and we got this as straight guys. If you think about it, it's the same thing. You lust after a woman in your heart. It's the same as actually doing it, whatever that verse is, right? Which is the most condemning verse in Christianity. The Jews don't have that. They don't live with that one. But did you have that? Like, were you told it's as bad to think it as it is to do it? And therefore, how can you separate this slap on the wrist, guilt, shame, when you're thinking about this shit all the time?
Yeah, so there was, and again, that's what, when I say the guilt shame thing, that was his goal, that was his ideal. Of course, in practice, it didn't work as well. There were so many moments where I was like, I'm the problem. But again, once you at least you meet with him on that weekly basis, you're like, okay, maybe it's something that I'm gonna, again, I can get rid of this, and that sort of gives you that little hope, that cruel optimism, that twisted hope that things will get better. But the ironic thing that I still think about, that I just find absolutely wild, is that he said to me one time, you know what, if you are, horny, if you're wanting to get off, what you can do is you can look at porn as long as it's straight porn. And looking back, I think to myself, this was a pastor, right? This was a Christian pastor. And if we are to hold up the verse that you just mentioned, right? The idea of lusting after a woman is just as bad as committing the act. What? But again, this is the twisted world of the new Christian right. This is the twisted world, an upside down moral world that really makes no sense. It's so hard to grab onto anything, even though there are such clear cut, right, wrong, good, evil, of God, of the enemy. There's still all of this gray that they still live into and don't acknowledge. And this is an example of it where I was told if I need to get off, well, just go look at a little bit of straight porn. Everything will be fine as long as it's not gay porn. And of course, this is establishing a hierarchy of sin here, right? A very clear hierarchy of sin that homosexuality is up here, all other sexual sin is below. Maybe bestiality is on par, but that's debatable. And so I think that for me, looking back, like you're right, like how what are the mental gymnastics that one has to perform in order to make any of this make sense? And I think that was such the confusing part of so much of this is that even though at the time you really, again, kept saying this makes sense, it didn't make sense. And your lived experiences of these teachings did not make sense. And the advice you were being given did not make sense. And, like you were saying, like where you're encouraged to go do these like masculine things, same, right? Like we were told to do all these things and to be around the boys and whatever. It didn't like none of it made sense. None of it obviously worked. But that was the world that I lived in. And that was the world that so many people live in. And it's so wildly confusing and so wildly difficult to navigate. And then it's also ironically difficult to get out of, right? That you have heard all of this for so long, and to deconstruct or to deprogram takes so much mental energy and spiritual energy, arguably. I'm not really a spiritual person at this point, I don't think. But I think at the time it really did. Like it took a lot of time to get this, tomfoolery out of my mind and to work through it or come to terms with it.
Did you notice when writing your book, and we do want to talk about your book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, that the methods of conversion therapies were the same? Was there anything that you noticed with people telling their stories that things were done a bit differently, or were the central tenets of it the same?
So conversion therapy, or more broadly conversion practices, happen in a multiplicity of contexts across religious traditions in different countries. They've happened in the past, they happen now, they're going to happen unfortunately in the future. So we have like quite a range of experiences. Now, to your point or to your question, do we see commonalities between conversion practices? Yes, like so many of them are not the same, but they rhyme, right? Like they're very, very similar. And what I found actually, when I read the stories that were submitted to me initially, and then ultimately I chose which ones to be in the book. The one that I resonated most with was actually one of the Australian contributors. And reading his story, Chris's story, he's actually big in the anti-conversion therapy movement or conversion therapy ban movement in Australia now, and he does actually a lot of really wonderful work. But reading his story, there was one moment, to give just a concrete example of how similar it was between, for instance, his experience and my experience, was he was talking about it, and he sort of like really quickly just mentions this experience of showering. And, for everyone in the world, like showering is a very hopefully a daily, sort of like commonplace thing. And, something that you don't even think about, you just do in the same way that you eat, the same way that you sleep, whatever. And showering, for those of us who were in, again, this is not just like for young queers within the church, but also for straights too, I'm only assuming, was that showering became a site of anxiety, in the sense that if you are to linger on certain body parts for too long, or if you are to touch yourself or to think about whatever for too long, you run the risk of masturbating, and then of course sinning, and then of course the really fun aftermath of feeling horrible about yourself. It's great. But I remember him talking about this, and this was something that we talked about in conversion therapy. We were talking about like showering and ways, like sort of like strategies to not give into temptation. And I think that like that's just one example of many, of how many sort of like teachings, again, transcend experiences that so many of us had similar experiences now. Is the experience that I had the exact same as conversion practices in, for instance, one of the contributors, his name is Nathan. In Nathan's story, is my story the same as his? No, he grew up in what he describes as a Chinese cult, and his conversion therapist was his mom. So a different dynamic, and wildly uncomfortable, and very, traumatic for him. And he talked about even like sort of like psychosomatic responses where his hair was falling out in the shower when, he was, in this or living at home with his parents. So that's obviously quite different. But I think that what the collection shows is that there's a really wide range of experiences. However, there are certainly unifying factors. And I think that the number one unifying factor across experiences, and the experience that I think the vast majority of people, particularly those who self-elect, who choose to go into conversion therapy, we can talk about choice later, and what it means to choose, but we'll table that. I think that for those of us who, again, self-elect to go into it, shame is the both which brings us into conversion therapy, and also the number one consequence of conversion therapy, according to a recent Canadian study. And so I think that's certainly something that is quite similar. Now, for the experiences within the new Christian right, like high control Christian traditions, most experiences are very, very similar. And they all are undergirded by conversion ideology, this like pseudoscientific understanding of human sexuality. But the experiences within the church are oftentimes quite similar. Yeah.
It's full on. Like every time I think about it, and we all know people I think that have gone through conversion therapy, and even while I was in the church, like I just, and we've spoken about this on the podcast. I always struggle with the whole fact is just like, if someone's gay, just fucking let them to be gay. It's totally, it is fine. There was an acceptance there, I think, which I always struggled with the judgment of it. But just seen so many people messed up from it, and some of those things that you started to touch on, you've certainly talked about your experience of it, but also started to talk about the experience of others. If pull out, we don't want to give people too many stories from your book because we want them to read it. That's the reality. But is there one that sticks with you? One that you were just like, fucking hell, that was really intense and heavy. And and it stood out because it was potentially not part of the blueprint of how conversion therapy was done or the response. Is there one that you can call out there?
Yeah. So there are a few that stand out for different reasons. Let me just, if you don't mind, I can read you like the first like 4 lines, if that works for you,
Yes, please.
of one story. And this is the opening story of the collection. So this sets the tone. Um, and I'll read it, and then I'll wait for your response, because I think it's typically a quite visceral response that people have when they hear this story. So this one's called "Sniffing the Gay Away." "I was thinking you could use feces," she said. "I'm sorry, feces?" I asked, for a quick second, confusing the word with freezies, which was a term for what us college kids with our checkered vans and backwards baseball caps used to call otter pops. The therapist corrected me. She did mean feces. "I'm supposed to eat feces?" "No, no, 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 no. You don't have to eat it. You'll just have to smell it while looking at pictures of men you find attractive." "Oh, good. That makes so much more sense." To give you, again, a teaser or a snapshot into one of the stories, this is, I think, a story that, for a number of reasons, stands out.
Yeah, it's one of the things, especially around the 2000s, there was the stories of the Mormons that were strapping people up to electrocution devices and showing them porn and zapping them, right? And I think a lot of people, maybe and maybe not, sort of realize, oh, that's not conversion therapy, until you told that story. So there is like really physical, intrusive is an understatement, but stuff that's just taking to people to places, just weird ass shit, right? I mean, it's not just this sitting down, talking to you, praying with you, and maybe putting their hand. And I'm not saying that didn't have its impact, of course. I heard you say it did, but too far up your thigh. Look, man, I'm stuck, right? But it's going too far.
Yeah, like this is an example in line with what you were saying, about electroshock, quote unquote therapy. That this is like it's called aversion therapy, right? It's associating something positive, i.e., your attraction, and associating that with something negative, whether it be physical pain in this case, an olfactory disgust or smell, whatever. But although not every story is perhaps shocking, and some stories within the collection might align and do align with a lot of what we think of when we think of conversion therapy, they're all equally sobering, right? And I think every story of conversion therapy in general really is a disgusting attempt to change someone, and not just change someone. And I think about this, and I talk about this in the introduction of the book, and it's something that I always bring up whenever I talk about this. And I credit my friend Christine Robinson, who co-authored this piece, this article that I talk about with her partner Sue Spivey. What those two argue in their piece is that conversion practices at their core are motivated by genocidal intentions. And at first that might sound like a really sort of histrionic or melodramatic or dramatic, claim. But when we think about it, of course, genocide is not always physical, right? Or it's not only just, just physical. That oftentimes when we think about, genocide in the Canadian context, in the Australian context, in the US context, right? It's oftentimes a cultural genocide. Where people are trying to erase an entire group of people by way of erasing their culture, erasing their heritage, erasing, their language, their religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With queers, if these folks, conversion therapists and the church more broadly, if they could have their way, queers would not exist. Like their actual desire is for us to not exist. And some might say, well, wait a second. It's not that they don't want you to exist. They just don't want you to exist the way that you are. It's like, right. So back to my original point, they don't want me, Luke Wilson or Lucas Wilson or whoever, whatever you want to call me, to exist, right? And so I think that, in the same way, if I said to a woman, I love you, I think you're great, I just don't like that you're a woman and I wish that, you weren't a woman, that woman would say, well, so you don't like me, like I'm a woman, what are you talking about? Like this is an inextricable part of one's identity. You cannot divorce that from who that person is. In the same way, sexuality,
No,
point
but
stands.
Luke, love the sinner, hate the sin.
Isn't
Come
that a
on,
cute
man.
little idea?
That's not what they're doing.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? And I think that it's wild where I have encountered with a number of people and some decently smart people too, where they'll say, well, that's just their belief. And I'm like, I don't give two hoots that that's just their belief, that it's according to their sincerely held religious convictions. I don't give a shit. I don't. I care that at the end of the day, this person doesn't want me to be here, right? That they don't want my friends to be here, that they don't want my entire community to be here. They don't want queer love. They don't want queer joy. They don't want queer community. They don't want queer representation. They don't want queer voices. They don't want queers. According to the definition of genocide, this is a genocidal intention, that these efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression fall under the umbrella of being motivated by genocidal intentions. And that, for me, I think when we think about it in those terms, all of a sudden it's not just, oh, well, isn't that so bad that, those queers over there are, experiencing what they're experiencing. No, this is a sustained global effort with a really well-funded, powerful network of evangelicals, white Christian fundamentalists, white Christian nationalists, whatever, who are doing their best to rid the world of queers. And that is why this collection, and that's why the work that I do, I think, needs to be done.
I think it's got a lot to do, and I don't mean to tell you, Luke, I'm just trying to resonate, but I think it's got a lot to do with the fact that from a and I'm very, very careful with this language, right? And forgive me if I'm a step behind, but the idea of moving from tolerance to affirming, that's what we hear, right? In sort of the ex-vangelical space, is trying to move churches from from rejection to tolerance to affirmation. But it still in there sits with me this idea, and coming back to what you were just saying, is that there's still something broken that needs to be fixed until you get to this point of affirmation. Like, rather than just saying homosexuality, heterosexuality are just two equally valid ways of being. So there's no fixing this, right? And so I think that's the basic assumption, right? Is that this is wrong, this is bad, but more than that, it's just not even valid. So the idea of wiping that out to them it makes perfect sense.
And even beyond that, I think that it's something to be cured. It's something to be fixed. It's something that is not just like, oh, let's just ignore that or forget that. It's like we're trying to actually like get rid of that in favor of something else. And again, I think for me, like when we're thought of as like sickness, right? Like where our desires are thought of in like a pathological sense, like we are seen as, again, something that needs to be cured. We're also seen as sinful. We're seen as demonic in a lot of cases, right? And I laugh because it's just absurd, right? We're seen in like a threat and a social contagious, framework, right? That we're like children are at risk by being around us. And this is something that, again, like it's something that haunts me to this day. When I don't like being around children. And to be completely frank, the actual reason I don't like being around children is because every time I am, I think in the back of my mind that the people around me are looking at me and think that I'm doing something or thinking something, maniacal, or that I have bad intentions. I'm haunted by this idea that I'm a threat to children. I'm contagious. I just won't be around children. I wish that I didn't have a care in the world about, being around kids, but I do. I absolutely do. And this is like an enduring fruit of what I've been taught for years.
The other thing is, talking about the right to not exist, or denying the right to exist. That's what happens with the church community. If you don't get fixed after a certain period of time, they let you go, and no one comes a chasing you, right? And look, that happens with a lot of different ex-vangelicals, not just gay ones, right? But it's like, if you can't play the role, eventually you just drift away. And as I think it was Josie McSkimming who said, it just kind of freezes over and you're out. And so it's interesting that you're talking about this. It comes to the point where it's like, at least out of sight, out of mind, and you do stop existing.
I remember thinking, it had been like years of not being in the church, and like you said, no one came after me, no one checked in. People just didn't give a shit that I was no longer around. But I remember eventually I was asked by a professor at University of Toronto. He's a Christian, but he said, like, "Hey, would you come speak to my church?" And I was like, "Sure." And so I didn't go into the church. Like, it was recorded online. This is like the time of like COVID. And so I did. We recorded this meeting, and I said to him, I said, it's kind of crazy because I've had, a few, obviously a little bit to think about this. I said, this is the first time I've been asked to come back to church. And it had been years, like years. And I was like, honest to God, like, all of those folks who so easily gave up our relationship simply because I was no longer, a believer, and also because I was gay. And it was a combination of both, oftentimes, or one or the other. I have an unbelievable lack of respect for those folks. And at this point, it doesn't hurt because I'm like, these are not my people. But at the time, it absolutely did. At the time when you realize, like, oh, no one's coming after me and no one cares. Um, it's such a horrible feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it just compounds the harm, doesn't it? I mean, you've been rejected on so many levels, and unfortunately, we do see it just far too often, and probably been guilty of it, to be really honest. I mean, when I was deep in the fold, you generally didn't reach out to people. I mean, there's one story that sticks in my mind with a young person that was in our youth group, and they were gay, and it was really obvious that they were really struggling, and they were in and out of church and very sporadic, and they overdosed, and they were in hospital, and the youth leaders had no interest in going and seeing them because they weren't committed to the cause. So it's just incredibly sad that those things happen over and over. For those of us, we know this stuff. We've experienced it. We know people that have experienced it. But what do you hope the book will do for those people that have never really come across conversion therapy in any way except for the words of it? What do you hope the book will do for them and for the greater
Mm-hmm.
cause?
Yeah. I think, whenever I think about audience for this book, I think primarily for survivors themselves, for those who went through it, and for them to feel in some way, shape, or form that their experience resonates with what they're reading on the pages, and that they feel in some ways affirmed, that they feel like they're not crazy. And in some cases, for people to realize that what they went through was conversion therapy. I think a lot of people who went through conversion therapy don't really conceptualize it as such, because that's just, they thought of it as pastoral counseling. They thought of it as, meeting with, this person in this like church basement or whatever. For me, I didn't understand my experience as conversion therapy until one of my colleagues said, "Oh, you went through conversion therapy." And I was like, "Oh, I guess I did." And again, I didn't think about it like that until she said that. So that's certainly a big part of it. Another big part of what I hope this book does is not just for survivors, but for the queer community in general. Because I think that although not everyone went through conversion therapy, everyone who is queer experienced conversion practices. And I think that might sound like perhaps an over or a totalizing or claim and overstepping my boundaries, but for every single queer kid who was told, don't sit like that, don't talk like that, don't play with that toy, you need to be on this sports team, you're not going to be in dance, you're going to be over here, like whatever it is, these are all direct and indirect messaging. This is all direct and indirect messaging that queers accumulate over years. And these are definitionally what we define as conversion practices. Efforts to change an individual's gender identity, sexual orientation, and or gender expression, right? So if the gender expression is that I'm a young boy and I'm, again, playing with Polly Pockets, which I did, that if my dad had have said, don't play with that, thank God my dad was like the coolest, didn't give two hoots. But if he had said, don't do that, that's, again, a discrete individual conversion practice. And so I hope that for queers that they were like, oh, wow, again, I didn't go through conversion therapy, but I did undergo, conversion practices. Beyond that, there's also straight people, right? There are a number of straight people whose gender expressions do not align with the sort of hegemonic, standard, stereotypical masculinity or femininity. And for them, when they were told as kids, oh, don't sit like that, don't act like that, don't be like that, whatever, that also, again, not just sort of like broaden it and say like everyone's included, but that is a conversion practice, right? It's an effort to change that person, to align that person with the heteronormative model. And so I think that that's also something that I hope that people, who are reading it are able to see. Beyond that, I hope that, in the same way that I hope that, women hope that like men are like identify as feminists and they're like, hey, and not just identify, but actually like live that out. And again, speak up when they hear sexist or misogynistic things. Queers want the same thing from straight people, right? And so I hope that when people who are straight, who do read this book, and I hope that there obviously are straight people who read this book, I hope that when they read this, they're like, again, especially in light of the idea that what we're talking about is genocidal in nature, the effort to get rid of us. And some people really do want us physically dead too. And my recent projects, I've been thinking about this and reading a number of sources that are like literally people within the New Christian Right talking about wanting us dead. But if we were to scale back and think more, again, in a cultural sense, that they understand it in these terms, I think this is important that we understand it according to appropriate and proper language to describe these experiences and these efforts. And I think that when we think about it in terms of motivated by genocidal intentions, all of a sudden, I think it becomes a little bit clearer why we all need to speak up. And so I would say for all of these reasons, I hope that the book speaks. I hope that this book communicates these messages to these various readers.
Hey, if someone is listening to this, or someone knows someone who has a loved one who is being pushed towards conversion therapy, someone who you're really concerned about what's happening there, have you got some hot tips for things that they could do to intervene in that, to potentially sidetrack someone actually entering into conversion therapy practices?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, just establishing your love for that person. We were talking a second ago about when we left the church and no one came after us. That clearly communicated to us that there were conditions upon conditions placed upon our relationship. That the condition was that we needed to stay within the fold. Otherwise, we're not going to be not only included, but we're also like not even thought about. We're sort of like not even afterthought. We're just not thought about. And that the love that they had for us was conditional. To say to someone, I love you, and not to say, even though you're gay, that's always like the worst thing you could say. It's oftentimes when people say, and they're giving it the good old college try, they're trying their best, like, I love you, even though you're gay. You're like, dear Lord, you didn't need to add that extra qualifier, but thank you. I think that just to say like, hey, I love you, period. That's a huge thing. That's a radical act. And I think that in and of itself, is super helpful. And I think that to say to someone, hey, I love you, and regardless of whatever they're saying, A, it's not true, but B, I'm here for you. If you ever want to talk, that is huge. I think like even when I was, really drinking the Kool-Aid, there were people who said things like that stood out to me, and I never forgot them. I always thought about, oh, so-and-so said this. They did make that space for me, and they offered that invitation. And that is something that, again, even when you are a diehard believer or whatever, you remember these things, and these people's messages are not forgotten. So I think that that's a big part too. Also, just offering resources, whether it be perhaps a more traditional approach to queer affirming acceptance within the church, like Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian, cool. But also like maybe more radical or more what's considered radical, according to like evangelical and conservative understandings of Scripture. Texts like Braden Robinson's new book, right? It's a book about accepting queers and Christians as queer Christians. Like these are resources that I think are really helpful. Like Justin Lee's Torn, like these other texts, like these are, I think, texts that can be really, really helpful for people. Rob Bell, perhaps, I don't know if he's still in vogue or if he has fallen out of favor, but I think these are some people, who, what is her name? Nadia Boltz Weber, or Weber Boltz, I forget her exact name, but I know that she's an affirming pastor, and she's, a badass. I think that these are, offering these resources is also really helpful. But so not just offering love, not just offering acceptance and the invitation to speak, but also offering these sort of like olive branches or lifelines. I think these are all really excellent ways to show someone an alternative path to entering into conversion therapy. Also, just the science behind it. There's no backing for any of these practices as effective. So that's also a damning critique against conversion therapy.
Luke, how do you feel then being ex-Christian gay? Where does that all fit in your life now? Because we've touched on it a little bit, right? You talked about the fact that you're not a believer anymore. Is there a big gang on the outside of gay ex-Christians? Is there do you guys have meetups? I'm joking, but what's the deal with that? Is there support for people, or do you just fall into the ex-vangelical crowd and it's just you're just part of the furniture there?
Well, Troy, we do have meetups, but they might be a little bit different than what you're talking about. Yeah, that's called a Tuesday night for me, but we won't get into those details. Just kidding. I would say that there are a number of deconstructing or deconstructed queers. There are also a number of folks who are still in some ways committed to faith or invested in matters of spirituality. Maybe not Christianity, or at least traditional or Orthodox Christianity, but sort of like mixing New Age ideas and thinking and spirituality with sort of Christian, principles or whatever. So for me, again, I'm not a person of faith, and it's funny, my faith journey, or me giving up my faith, and it was a giving up, and it's a gift that I don't want back. I return to sender. But when I gave up my faith, it had nothing to do with my sexuality. Most of my research in the past was actually in the Holocaust. And most of my publications are actually in Holocaust studies. And so with that, it was me researching the Holocaust that pushed me to question everything. Maybe this is a question that I should have been asking a long time before, like much sooner. The question of theodicy, right? Reconciling, a good God with evil. That for me was what pushed me out of the church. It wasn't my faith, or sorry, it wasn't my sexuality. It was absolutely my research in the Holocaust. I think that maybe that's why it's less important to me to really connect with those people. However, what is sort of funny is that I didn't seek those people out, but eventually we kind of found each other, right? It wasn't like I was like, oh, I need to go find those ex-gay, or sorry, ex-gay, those ex-Christian gays. It was just, I want to find people who are deconstructing. I didn't even really think about it in those terms, because for me, I have a really great friend group, or friend groups. I have a really great family. And those people really supported me. And so they were really helpful in a lot of this. But when I discovered that there was an online world, which for me, again, like I'm a late bloomer. I'm like 10 years behind everything. I should have figured these things out much earlier. I just didn't. And so for this, I was like, oh my gosh, there is a community out there, and they were online. And it just so happens that the folks I connected with, by and large, or the people I really connected with, were trans and queer. Chrissy Stroop is someone I think of who's just this absolute badass. Chrissy Stroop's a trans Russian historian turned historian of white Christian nationalism, and she's just this like unbelievable brain, and she's just wonderful. And then there are other queers like Kevin Garcia, Brandon Robinson, like these other people who again, they do a lot of this work. And so for me, I think that I didn't seek it out, but I found it eventually just by way of the deconstruction world. A number of straight people as well. Bradley Onishi and, other folks, within that world. But for me, yeah, I think for me, the folks I really connect with are deconstruction, folks in general. But the queers, we always find a way to find each other. there's like no way of keeping us apart. Gaydar is real and even online, but no, we just sort of like make our way and we have. And so I'm very thankful for these folks.
Awesome. Luke, it has been an amazing chat, and we've gone nearly an hour and a half. Like we could keep going for a long time, and you are hilarious, which is great, but also a great storyteller. And I think it's the way you are able to articulate the themes and the horrendous shit that has happened to people who are same-sex attracted or shame-sex attracted, as you may say, is incredible. And we encourage people to get your book and read it, and I'm sure that they'll resonate.
Let's be clear on the title for people. It's Shame, Sex Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy.
Yes, I went the short version because I'm so familiar with it. It's like calling someone by their first name, all that sort of thing.
Like Luke or Lucas, yeah.
Luke, Lucas, Dr. Wilson. Where do they get it? Where do they get the book?
Yeah, so if you're in Australia, the Nile is, I think, one of the better ways of getting, or the easier ways of getting it. Of course, Amazon is possible, but Amazon's the devil, so we don't go there. In Canada, through Indigo. In the US, Barnes and Noble. Also through JKP's website. The press is called JKP, Jessica Kingsley Publishers. You can get the book through them. And in Canada and the US and in Britain. In Britain, there's another bookstore that it's like the main sort of like version of like the Nile or Indigo in Canada, whatever. I forget the name, but those are the places you can get the book. Most major retailers are going to carry it.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we put all those links in the show notes, whether you're on YouTube or whether you're on your favorite audio platform. The other thing I'm going to get you to do, Luke, is you mentioned a whole heap of books today. So I'm going to get you to send me a list of those, and I'll make sure that I put those in to the show notes as well to make it easier for people to find. Luke, Lucas, Dr. Wilson, we have had such a good time with you today. You've really made us laugh. It's just been awesome. So I want to really thank you for being a part of today on I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Brian, anything you want to say before we wrap this and get on with our Saturday and Luke gets on with his Friday?
No, not at all. Just a big thank you again. And we have been chatting probably on and off for over 6 months about you coming on. So I'm rapt that we finally got you on to chat about this. And it's just our listeners are going to get a lot from this, but they'll get a lot more from it if they buy your book. So just want to encourage them to do that. So thanks again, Luke.
Thank you, guys. This has been too much fun.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great ex-vangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Jonathan O'Brien. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.